strong leader.
Amen. Right. Amen. Thank you, brother.
Once again, he helped me with traffic. It's pretty late. That's a young boy. These are three boys. Brian now, he just turned 43, and Dave turned 45. And Mike's birthday last week, Cinco de Mayo. He just turned 47. But where we're at, we're at a special place in Ohio. We're at the Serpent Mound. And the Serpent Mound kind of gives you the idea of the height. And if you look close, you can see it weaving through the countryside. That thing is 1,348 feet long. And of course, nobody has any idea when it was built or how they built it. But it's a serpent, and at the end, it has it's like a swallowing an egg. But, how about America and American history that we don't understand? Let's see the next map here. How big was that hog?
200 pounds or something.
They killed 200 just a couple weeks ago. They killed. And so wild hogs and horses, so what we think of but before that, there was a race of people, the Native Americans here, that were mound builders. Right outside, present day, St. Louis, there was a city in ancient time called Cahokia. And they've excavated out, there's mounds, all mounds around there that they have built. And from the artifacts, they know that they traded with people, from the Great Lakes, even down to the Gulf, from the shells and different things they had. So they know they had a society, and it's reported that there were a lot of these people that were of average size, but there were also giants there. The men were like 9 feet tall, and the women were like 7 feet tall. But you had them existing along with the native people. And throughout these mounds, which are serpent mounds in Ohio, but all across the country, we have these mounds. And there's a famous statement by, it was actually written down by Abraham Lincoln. When he looked at Niagara Falls, he said, that extinct race of giants whose bodies are found in the mounds of America once gazed on these falls. So Abraham Lincoln realized that in ancient time in America, there were giants living, and they built these mounds. One of the last remaining giants, you've heard of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Well, there was an Indian chief called Tuscaloosa, and he was a giant, and he supposedly met even like President Jefferson. And you probably heard of Magellan, the Straits of Magellan. He was the first, or his group, first to circumvent the globe. Actually, Magellan didn't make it. He got killed in the Philippines, but a few of the survivors, they started with 5 ships, and I think 1 ship that finally made it back. But in their journals, they write about when they went off the coast of South America by Patagonia, they saw native people that were average size, but they marveled because they were naked. And as you get closer to the South Pole, it's cold. But then they came across, they saw another naked man on the beach jumping and leaping, but he was a giant. And when they got out to meet him, he said they came up to his waist. And so, and then throughout history, the other Spanish explorers talked about witnessing giants. And we've talked before about the lies in America. See, in old time, people used to, believe in the Bible, believe in that the earth is not millions of years old, but just thousands of years old. But we said the great lies of today Well, number one is climate change. They want you to believe that we're worried about destroying the planet, but that's a way of getting people to worship and serve the creation instead of the creator. And of course, the other big lie is evolution. And see, these are things that only developed like in the 1800s. When Darwin wrote his book, Origin of Species, that's when people started getting away from God and started to believe things like evolution. And it's at the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, there were two directors of the Smithsonian that they did great efforts to destroy these records of giants, and things because it didn't fit into the evolutional pattern. But we know that giants existed because of the Bible. You know, we can't, in our mind, we can't hardly fathom what the pre-flood world was like. But we're just told, Peter refers to 2 Peter when he says scoffers are going to, in the last days, you know, say, where's the promises coming? All things continue as they were from the beginning. He said these people willingly forget that there was a world, a whole different world, that was destroyed in the past time. And I think that's the where they came up with it. You've heard the legend of Atlantis. You know, they talk about Atlantis, that there was an advanced race of people that disappeared into the sea. I think that's simply the pre-flood world. And Mason Dad, our son Mike, he taught a lesson years ago that kind of opened my eyes, that in that pre-flood world, you'd have had one landmass. And so before in the pre-flood world, there was no Atlantic Ocean. And if you read in the Bible, when the flood came, it said that God broke up the fountains of the great deep. And so, if you look at the ocean, the world with the water gone, you see there's a ridge that goes around the whole globe. And so, I think that when you accept the Bible as it is, that it makes things clear, makes you understand what true history is about. And I like to even think about Noah and his sons. Now, they were told to build that ark. It's 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. There were 3 decks. So it was big enough for each floor to be 15 feet apart. How big were Noah and his sons? We don't know. They could have been 10, 12 feet tall. We know he lived to be 950 years. We just things were a lot different. And we know that after the flood, that his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, repopulated the earth. And we know that from their descendants, there were giants. And we read about throughout the Bible. There's an account that sometimes we don't pay much attention to. It's in Genesis 14. This is at the time of Abraham. And it said, it came to pass in those days, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, the king of Eleashar, and Kedor Larimor. I just love some of these names. Isn't that a great name? Kedor Larimor. Anyway, so you had these 4 kings, and they were coming to fight. And these were kings like from Mesopotamia. And they were coming down around the Dead Sea area to fight against 5 kings. There's 4 kings against 5 kings. It said that they had served King Kedor Larimor for 13 years, or 12 years, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year, Kedor Larimor and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim and Ashtaroth. And they also struck the Zunam and Ham and Eman and Kirjath-Jearim. So these names, Rephaim and Zuzam and Eman, these were names given to giants. Now, one of the most famous accounts, a little while here, we know is in Numbers chapter 13. And this is when the children of Israel had been in Egypt. They went to Mount Sinai, where they received the law. They built the tabernacle, and they were coming up to the promised land. They could have been in the promised land within 2 years after leaving Egypt. But we know what happened in Numbers 13. They sent out these spies to spy out the land. Now, Caleb and Joshua, they brought back a good report. They said, you know, it is a land flowing with milk and honey, and we can take it. But the other 10 spies, they brought back a negative report. And one thing that they discouraged them about, they talked about that they saw giants in the land.
He said in verse 28, he said, the people who dwell in the land are strong, the cities are fortified, very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak. Now that's another name. Anak and Anakim are going to be references in the Bible to these giants. And when they, on down to verse 32, they gave the children of Israel a bad report. They said, the land we spied out, the lands in which we spied out the land, it devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw were of great statures. We saw giants, the descendants of Anak, there again. And it said, and we were in our own sight like grasshoppers. So these people were so big that they felt like insects. And it's not the only place. You go to Deuteronomy. The name Deuteronomy means second law. And what happened is after because of their unbelief, they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years while that unbelieving generation died off. And then Moses, before he died on Mount Nebo, he gave the law again. That's what Deuteronomy is. He's repeating the law. He's repeating things that have happened to them on their way. And if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 2, beginning there in verse 9, he said, the Lord said, do not harass Moab, nor contend with battle. I will not give you any of their land as possession, because again, the Moabites were related to Israel. And it says, in verse 10, he said, the Eman had dwelt there in time past, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. And they were also regarded as giants, like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them Eman. So there's that name again. But the Moabites had dispossessed, had taken that land from these giants who had formerly lived there. If you go over in verses 19, that's it. He said, and when you come near the people of Ammon, do not harass or meddle with them, for I will not give you any of their land for the people of Ammon to possess, because I've given it to the descendants, because again, once again, they were related to Lot as a possession. And that was also regarded as a land of giants, because giants formerly dwelt there, but the Ammonites called them Zanzuman. So they had these names, even, they had different names for them, but these were giants. And he said these were people as great and as numerous and as tall as Anakim, but the Lord destroyed them before them, and also he possessed them and dwelt in their place. So, we have tall people in our thing, but it's hard to picture real giants. So what they're talking about, our cousins, Pam and Steve, I've heard me talk about them. They're very close to us because Steve went to high school with us, and then after we became Christian in the 70s, we baptized Steve, and he met my cousin Pam at a Bible study. They got married, and every time we had a boy, they had a girl, and so the kids all went to school together, got to graduate. But his girl, Steve had to tuck, but he was in a house of four women all the time. But then he ended up with 3 really great son-in-laws. They've been a great help to him over the years. We left with his middle son-in-law. Jason is 6'9", and we were at church with Mason and them a few years ago, and his sister was sitting with us, and little Madeline, and we were sitting behind Jason, and they saw me the rest of us stand up and sing, and Jason stood up, Madeline went. She hadn't seen anybody say 6'9", but these people described in the scripture are obviously more than that. Of course, the most famous giant we know about is that Goliath, where we get the name Goliath. Well, he's described in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17, and it says that it paints a picture here of the Israelites were on one mountain and the Philistines were on one another. Well, this guy Goliath would come down every day and make a challenge. He said, the Israelites, he said, send me a man, we'll fight. If he kills me, we'll serve you, but if I kill him, you're going to become our servant. But when it described him, verse 14, he said, the champion, Goliath, they said his height was 6 cubits in a span. A cubit is like 18 inches. So 6 cubits, the saying, so he was like 9'6", if you can comprehend that. 9'6", but he goes on, he talks about it, he had a bronze helmet, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the coat weighed like 5,000 shekels of bronze. Now, I don't know exactly how heavy that is, but it sounds pretty heavy to me. And he said he had a bronze armor on his leg, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the iron spearhead, again, was 600 shekels of silver, and his shield bearer went before him. So they just described this spectacular guy. And of course, we know it's a great Bible story, though, because David is going to take, his older brothers were in Saul's army, and he went to take him supplies, and he heard, the challenge, and David's like, what about this uncircumcised Philistine? We need to take care of him. And when Saul questioned him, a lot of times, people, they refer to David as a shepherd boy. He was a youth, but every indication he was full grown. But later, he's going to marry Saul's daughter, and Saul even offered him his armor. We know Saul was a big guy. They said that Saul was head and shoulders above everybody else, but he was no giant. He wasn't like this man. But it was a great story because David, of course, we know, goes and takes the 5 stones out of the brook, and when he comes out, of course, Goliath gets mad. He sees him coming. What am I, a dog? You come after me with a stick? But what did David say? You come to me with the spear and the sword, but I come to you in the name of God. When Saul had questioned David's ability to challenge this giant, he told him, he was a shepherd. He said, when a lion or a bear came after my sheep, he said, I've killed. He said, and this is, I have killed a lion and killed a bear. I'm going to kill this uncircumcised. And he told him, he said, you come to me with a sword, I come to you in the name of God. And he said, I'm going to kill you today and take off your head. And it says that David ran towards him. And of course, struck him in the head. He fell on his face. And then he took his own sword and killed him, cut off his head, for provided a great victory. But there's an even more fascinating passage than this, because what had happened, obviously, in early times, we know there were giants throughout that land of Canaan, but they had just dwelt in that land of Palestine. So we got a map of Canaan there. So, because they referred to these giants that the Moabites and Ammonites had conquered, and there was another Ammonite king when Moses had led the people up and they had conquered this land on the east side of the Jordan. There was a king by the name of Og, and they said he was the last remnant of some of these giants, and they said, behold, his bed is in a nearby town, and they described his bed, a bed of iron that was over 13 feet long. So Og, once again, had to be, 12, 13 feet to have a bed that big. And so Israelite and the people had killed these giants, but now it was in this land of the Philistines that some of these remnants remained. And I said Goliath is not the only one you read about, because you go over to the book of 2 Samuel 21, there verse 15. It said, when the Philistines were at war with Israel, David and his servants with him went down and fought against the Philistines, and David grew faint. Then Ishbi-Benob, there's no other name, anything like that? Ishbi-Benob. So Ishbi-Benob, who was one of the sons of the giants, the weight of whose bronze spear was 300 shekels, who was bearing a new sword, thought he would kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and struck the Philistine and killed him. Now, Abishai was David's cousin, and Zeruiah was like his aunt, and his brother Joab was the commander of David's army. There was 3 brothers that were his cousins. So this was his cousin Abishai came and saved David, and from that point on, the men would not allow David to go to war anymore. They said, you've got to stay back. Let's quench the light of Israel. And it said it happened that after this, there was a battle with the Philistine, and then it said Shebekah the Hushite killed Saph, who was also one of the sons of the giant. And again, there was war at Gob with the Philistine, and Elkanah, that he killed the brother of Goliath. So Goliath had a brother who was also a giant, and he killed him. And then verse 20 is fascinating. He said, and yet again, there was war in Gath, and there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on his feet, and 24 in number. And he also was born to the giants. And so when he had defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimna, David's brother, killed him. So these 4 were born of the giants of Gath, and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. And that's some studies that I've seen about the giants they found in America, and some of them had the same thing, 6 digits, and some of them even have like double rows of teeth. But there were giants that lived on the earth at one time. Again, some history people may not want you to know that because it doesn't fit in with the evolutionary theory. But the fact that they're named in the Bible, we know it is true. That David and his men, they were giant slayers. But there's another giant that needs to be slayed that everyone talk about, and this is a giant of racial prejudice. You got another map? Let's see. Back in, once again, a lot of people don't know their history. And over in Europe, back in like the 1500, the superpowers then were Spain and Portugal. They were the superpowers. They were the sailors. And what had happened, they were arguing over, who's going to have what land or whatever. And so the Pope settled it. And so he drew an arbitrary line down the middle of the land, and he went just like that. And so that's why the Portuguese, they only had one colony in America, and that's Brazil. And these people in Portugal, they had an active slave trade going back at this time. It's reported later America is going to import like 300,000 slaves from Africa, but in Brazil, the Portuguese brought in 3 million slaves, and that's why if you look at there are pretty people there in Brazil, but they're from Spanish and African descent, and that's why they're different. Now, the Spaniards, they went ahead and conquered the rest of the Americas, and of course, got the gold, from the Incas, and then the Mayas, and later the Aztecs up in Central America and Mexico. And that really set the stage, because again, they were a superpower, like they're the 1600s. And we know that that's the oldest city in Florida, St. Augustine. The Spaniards came to Florida in the 1500s. But this set the stage for piracy, because the Spaniards had all that gold and wealth. Well, then countries like England and France, they were just coming to power. And like the Queen of England, she allowed some of her sea to be what they call privateers, to attack those Spanish ships and take their gold. And so that's the whole Pirates of the Caribbean, all that. And it's not really till the 1800s, so America got strong, that we finally brought it into that time of piracy. Some of the U.S. presidents were, fought some of the last remnants of the pirates, in the Caribbean there, even they were in North Carolina and in the Keys, and like that. But there's always, unfortunately, there's always been racial prejudice in the world. We know that slavery, we read in the book of Genesis, Joseph's own brother sold him as a slave to Egypt. And we read throughout the Old Testament different people being enslaved by others. We know from New Testament time that slaves were a part of the culture. There's writings in the books on how slave owners should treat their slaves and how slaves should react to their masters. So slavery, unfortunately, is something that's real. And unfortunately, it's a part of America's history. The real tragic part is, because we fought a civil war in 1861 to like 1865, it ended slavery. But how tragic is, there was still so much racial prejudice in this world till 1960. So it took 100 years, although slavery was ended 1860. Really, wasn't until the civil rights movement in the 1960s that people were started realizing how bad racial prejudice is. But we know that some of the worst racist people on the planet were, of course, the German people. They believed in what they called the Aryan race. They thought they were very superior. Well, it just so happened that in 1936, Germany was going to host the Olympics. And I don't think things like this happen by coincidence. There was a young black fellow by the name of Jesse Owens from Decatur, Alabama, and he went to Ohio State University. Well, Jesse Owens attended that 1936 Olympics. So you got Hitler sitting there believing that the Aryans, that they're superior, and in front of the whole world, this young black man from Alabama on the 100 meter, 200 meter, the broad jump, so he's taking on his gold medal. And so there was Jesse Owens. So he killed that giant of racial prejudice, showing us that, you know, it has no place in the world. And of course, as Christians, of all people, we especially know we can't be prejudiced. If you believe the Bible, you can't be prejudiced because
Amen.
from the same place. You know, I love what Paul, when he's talking, one blood, all nations of men dwell in the earth. So we might have a little different appearances outside, but inside we're all the same. God's made from one blood. And so prejudice can't exist. And I brought this up before. I don't think it's just a coincidence. If you go back even to Numbers chapter 12, verse 1. Now, who was one of the greatest men in the Bible? Moses. And just arbitrarily it says that Moses married an Ethiopian woman. Now, his brother and sister gave him a hard time about that, and God had strong rebuke for him. But once again, why was that found in the scripture? I think that God letting us know that, again, we can marry whoever we want. Why? Because we're from one blood. God made all nations of men. So we know giants lived on the earth. They were slain. They didn't last. We know racial prejudice exists, but it's another giant that needs to be defeated. And the last giant I want to talk about is the giant of skepticism. Well, once again, you know, in early times, if you look in the 1700s, if you look at a Encyclopedia Britannica, it'll tell you that the Earth is only a few thousand years old. It gives you a proper time of when the flood occurred. You know, it was real biblical history, but only to the influence of like Darwin. And then as we got universities, more professors, they want to push evolution, get you away from God. They try to undermine what the Bible says. Well, in the 20th century, the skeptics, they had a pretty good argument because the oldest copy of the Old Testament that was in existence was from AD 1000. Okay? So the skeptics said, how do we know that that is the same Bible that they had 1,000 years early at the time of Jesus, or even earlier yet in the Old Testament? So they had a pretty good argument. How do we know? Well, in 1947, the shepherd, Mohammed the Wolf, he lost his sheep. And he was out around the Dead Sea, and there were caves. The Dead Sea that's one of the lowest spots on earth. The Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level. And so it's a dry, arid climate. And when he was looking for a sheep, he threw a rock in a cave and he heard something break. And that discovery, that's how they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he said, why is that important? Well, there were a group of people, the Essenes, these were like the Amish people of their day back at the time of Jesus and before, in the period between the Old and New Testament. Well, these people wanted to get away from society, so they went out there and started their community. And they collected these scrolls and put them in those jars to preserve. You say, well, why is that important? Because these were like dated back to before the time of Christ. So these scriptures they have were 1,000 years old. Like I said, at the time, in the first part of the 20th century, the oldest New Testament we had was like 81,000. Well, they find these Dead Sea Scrolls that are 1,000 years older, and guess what? Isaiah was Isaiah, Psalms was Psalms. And they found every book of the Old Testament except the book of Esther. I still always say that. But you know what? Since then they found Esther too. And you can go, in Jerusalem, they have the Dead Sea Scrolls on display. But see, what that did, that destroyed that giant of skepticism. There were people that said, how do we know this is the same Bible? Well, they found scriptures that were 1,000. And once again, look at God's providence. That he could have those scrolls hidden in that dry, arid climate where they could exist for thousands of years. And through all human history, through, the wars and everything that happened, they just stood there in that cave until the time was right, 1947. And they've been studied ever since, and I greatly appreciate it. So, and that's the way we need to approach these things like David did the giant. You come to me with sword and spear, but we come to you in the name of God. So if we accept the Bible and its truth, we can destroy any critic that's out there. So I hope this lesson has been an encouragement to you today. If you need to